Good morning. I want to start with a story, one that you may have heard before, but in this context, I hope perhaps it strikes you a little differently. It was September 15th, 1963. It was the day of the Youth Day Sunday service at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. They were all getting ready for this Youth Day Sunday service. They were in the church basement. They had on white dresses, and they were making final touches to their outfits. It's in the middle of this that the bomb exploded. The blast left a hole in the floor 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It decapitated poor Cynthia. Her parents could only recognize it was their baby girl by the ring on her finger and the shoes on her feet. In the aftermath of this church bombing, of course, people far and wide, not only nationally but internationally, expressed outrage. How could this happen? It's such a tragedy. On the very next day, a white lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr., he was scheduled to give a talk at Birmingham Young Men's Business Club, a group of white businessmen, and he changed his speech at the last minute in light of this bombing. And he asked this group of Birmingham's most distinguished citizens, he asked them, who did it? Who threw that bomb? Was it a Negro or a white? And to his all-white audience, he answered for them. He said, the answer should be, we all did it. We're all responsible for this bombing and the one before it and the one before it. We all did it. He went on to say, the who is every little individual who talks about the niggers and spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. The jokester, the crude oaf whose racial jokes rock the party with laughter. But Charles Morgan Jr. went yet further. He didn't leave the church out of his analysis. He said, did those ministers, meaning the white ministers, visit the Negroes in their hour of travail? Did many of them go to the homes of their brothers and sisters to express regrets in person or pray with crying relatives? Do they admit Negroes into the ranks of their churches? The title of my book is The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American church's complicity in racism. Now, don't get me wrong, there were plenty of Christians who were actively supporting racism, actively constructing racist ideas and actions. But that was a relatively small number of people, quantitatively speaking. And it's too easy to think about the people who burned crosses or planted sticks of dynamite at churches and to look at them and point to them and say, see, those are the real racists. That's not me. I'm not involved. But the reality is that Birmingham had already earned the nickname Bombingham. That there was a section in the city called Dynamite Hill, which means this wasn't the first time this happened. And so how could it thrive? How could actions as egregious as a church bombing continue to happen? It required the complicity of a vast number of people who may not have been actively doing the acts of violence, but by their silence and their ignorance and their apathy, they allowed it to continue. My point here is simply this. The truth, as we talk about speaking the truth is that the most egregious acts of racism happen within a context of compromise. So, as I said, The title of the book is The Color of Compromise. One of the questions I'm surprised I don't get more often is, what exactly is the color of compromise? If you had to guess, what would you guess? Powder blue? Pink? Periwinkle? Who knows? What I propose to you is that the color of compromise is at least 3 colors. The color of compromise is green, to indicate the greed of slave traders, plantation owners, and everyone who practiced or promoted race-based chattel slavery because they put profit over people. The color of compromise is also white, for white supremacy, which tells a story of racial difference that places white people on top or at the center, and then people of color, especially black people, become other, lesser, and marginalized. And lastly, the color of compromise is red, for the blood that flowed as a result of the physical violence that the greed and white supremacy had to use in order to maintain power. Now, what you're about to hear from me is all just a beginning. What I want you to know is that this is a very long conversation, and there's a lot more to learn. So if you want to continue to engage, I do rants on social media, and you can follow there at Jemar Tisby, both Instagram and Twitter. Also have a couple of websites that I'm involved in. thewitnessbcc.com. We have literally hundreds of articles tackling current events, issues of race, religion, politics, from dozens of different authors across the racial and ethnic spectrum. I encourage you to check out that website. And I have my own website, jemartisby.com, where I put a lot more of my historical resources. Finally, I don't know if you listen to podcasts. If not, it's a great way to pass the time. If you're doing dishes or out for a run or exercising, you can turn on one of these podcasts and listen to commentary. Footnotes is one where I talk about current events, and then Pass the Mic I co-host with Tyler Burns. I think the episode coming out most recently, we're going to be talking about Kanye and his new Jesus is King album. So you can dive in there. As we begin, we have to start here. The color of compromise is green. There's a quote by James W.C. Pennington, who was a minister and abolitionist in the 1800s, a black man. And he said, "The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, and the cart whip, the starvation, the nakedness are all its inevitable consequences." Have you heard the phrase race-based chattel slavery? Usually you just hear slavery, but it's a particular form of slavery that the United States practiced. It was race-based, it's focused on color, but it was also chattel. What is chattel? Chattel is property. What happened in the U.S. form of slavery is that it turned people into property. Many people say that slavery was America's original sin. I think it might be more accurate to say that slavery was America's original symptom, and America's original sin was greed. Why then? Why? Think about it. Why did it take America's bloodiest war, the Civil War, to finally emancipate enslaved people? Why was slavery so resilient? Because there was money to be made. Think about it. In a capitalist system, your goal is to maximize profit and minimize loss. If you ever look at a budget or have to manage one, typically the biggest slice of the budgetary pie goes to salaries, wages, and benefits for your employees. So what's the best way to cut costs? Well, you lower salary, wages, and benefits. Or better yet, you don't pay your laborers at all. That's what happened over centuries of race-based chattel slavery, as people of African descent literally built this country based off their blood, sweat, and tears, and were paid not a cent. Race-based chattel slavery is fundamentally an economically exploitative system. This is why the Mississippi Articles of Secession, January 1861, Mississippi's second state to secede from the Union after South Carolina, the Articles of Secession lists its reason. Why are we breaking away from the Union? Here's what it says. Mississippi said, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce on the earth." Did you hear that language? Greatest material interest. It's commerce. They're viewing this as a business transaction, as chattel, as property. And by the way, if anyone ever says that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, point them to this. It's that our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. That's why when slave traders shipped human beings from the west coast of Africa to parts of North America, they weren't really worried about the comfort of their passengers, because they didn't think of them as passengers. They thought of them as property. Most slave ships weren't built to transport hundreds of people. They had to be retrofitted to do so, and when they did that, they weren't thinking about comfort. They were thinking in terms of cargo and how do you pack as many people on board in one trip as possible. It's just like when you move into the dorm or your apartment each year. When you rent that truck or you get your car, what you're trying to do is turn and twist and fit boxes and bags and clothes and everything in there, get as much in as possible so you can make as few trips as possible. They did the same thing with human beings. When you learn history, certain historical facts stick out to you just randomly. As I was researching this time period, one of the facts that stuck out was that sharks would often follow behind these slave ships. You know why? Because people would inevitably die packed on board these ships. And what would you do with the body? You couldn't give it a proper burial. You had no place to put them, so they tossed human beings overboard. And the sharks would follow behind for a free meal. Christians, too, were complicit in this barbaric trade. This is a man named Olaudah Equiano. He was kidnapped from the area now known as Nigeria. He was part of the Igbo tribe. He was 11 years old when he and his sister were captured. And he wrote a journal, an autobiography of his experience. And he talked about this family separation because if money is the motive, then keeping families together doesn't matter. This is what he said. "The next day proved of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced, for my sister and I were then separated, while we lay clasped in each other's arms. It was in vain that we besought them not to part us. She was torn from me and immediately carried away, while I was left in a state of distraction not to be described. And for several days, I did not eat anything but what they forced into my mouth." Equiano would later go on to become a Christian. And as black folks have always done, they saw through the hypocrisy of a slave-holding religion. And in his journal, Equiano says this: "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learn you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you?" Equiano, whose sister is stolen from him, he's stolen from his land, and then his only family relation ripped apart. He's asking white Christians who claim the name of Christ, did you learn this from God? Are you following the golden rule, treat others as you would want to be treated? I'll give you one more quote. This comes from a historian. He said, cynical though it may sound, it's not an exaggeration to submit that the critical fact in determining who opposed slavery and who supported it was their Christian faith? No. He says it was a consequence entirely of political and economic factors. All of the Christian conviction in the world could not dent the purse of one slaveholder. That's why the only R word more controversial in Christian circles than racism is reparations. Now, we can debate how reparations should actually be distributed, but what should not be up for debate, however, is that for centuries, enslaved people labored to build the wealth of this country and were not financially compensated. And then even after emancipation, General Sherman offers Field Order 15, gives a swath of land along the East Coast to recently freed black people, 40 acres to be precise, along with that a mule to help them work the land. That 40 acres and a mule symbolized economic independence and a chance to stand on your own 2 feet financially that was actually given but then later rescinded. So these recently freed black people got nothing. But you know who did get reparations? White slave owners. Because if slaves are property, then what happened in emancipation is that the government took your property, which is actually people, and in compensation for taking your property, which is actually people, they gave you money for that. So we have paid reparations, just not to the enslaved. All I'm saying is we can't have a serious conversation about racial justice unless we talk about money. Church folk don't like to talk about money too much, but we got to. I got to move on. The color of compromise is green, but it's also white. One of the themes in the book is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. Racism never goes away, it just adapts. Why? Because as long as this idea of white supremacy persists, then racism and racial inequality will remain. It'll change forms, but it will remain. Racism is based on the underlying myth of white supremacy or the narrative of racial difference, as Daniel Hill, the author of White Awake, describes it. White supremacy is one of those controversial trigger words, right? That's fine. You don't like that? You can call it the narrative of racial difference. It means the same thing, and the impact is the same. So why? Why do we keep seeing racism? Well, if you look at U.S. history, you can divide the manifestations of racism into 3 broad periods. Race-based chattel slavery, which was in some ways the most obvious, physical chains and shackles on people. But then after emancipation, the period from 1877, post-Reconstruction, to about 1954 and the Brown v. Board of Education, making it illegal to segregate based on race in public schools. That period, known as Jim Crow, had legalized forms of segregation. That was also still relatively obvious because they had signs that said whites only, or Negroes or coloreds only, or black people had to enter through the back, or they had sundown towns that said you had to be out of town by sundown if you were a person of color or face violent reprisals. That was relatively obvious, but now we live in a society that is called racialized. That's a term taken from Michael Emerson and Christian Smith's book, Divided by Faith, which I highly recommend. 2 sociologists analyzing why white evangelicals tend not to understand race very well. And what they're saying in that book is that even though legalized forms of segregation have gone away, you can't use the terms black and white to discriminate in the law anymore. There are still ways to discriminate racially without using those words. So the question is, after all this supposed progress, why do we keep seeing racism pop up? It's because of that underlying narrative, that story of white supremacy, or of racial difference that says white is right. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and the person who spearheaded the lynching memorial down in Montgomery, Alabama, said, "The North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war." I think there's something to that. Now, what does white supremacy or whiteness do? Understand, when I talk about whiteness, I'm talking about a concept, an ideology, an idea, and not particular individual white people. A lot of people get offended when I talk about whiteness and white supremacy because they say, "Hey, you're talking about me and I'm not racist." I don't know whether you are or aren't. I do know this system is. So when I talk about whiteness or white supremacy, understand that I'm talking about the idea and not an individual person. If you're a person of color, it's helpful to make that distinction in conversation. Otherwise, you'll face a lot of roadblocks because people immediately say, "Well, you're calling me racist." Well, maybe you are, but that's not my point right now. I'm just talking about the ideology. What does whiteness do? It has three essential functions, at least. There could be more. One, it obscures ethnicity. This is for people who are considered white. So if you are of European descent, at some point, your ancestors were identified as British or French or Swedish or Dutch or German or what have you. But when they crossed that ocean and entered into what became the United States, they became what? White. Because over here, there's more cultural currency to whiteness than Britishness or Frenchness or Germanness. Are you following me? This has deep implications for what white people can do about race. What whiteness does is it erased your ethnicity, it erased your nationality, which means it erased your language, it erased your history, it erased your heritage, your culture, your dances, your foods. All of that goes away and it's subsumed under this broad label, white. I went to seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, and it was an odd thing that happened. It drew students from all over the country, from Ohio and Indiana and the West Coast and the East Coast down to the Deep South. And when they first got there, you kind of knew they weren't from around there. But within a semester or two, these young white men would grow beards and start wearing bow ties and wear seersucker suits. And all of a sudden, they looked like they were out of the 1830s. I said, "What is going on here? This is not you. You didn't speak with an accent before you came down here. You weren't wearing bow ties." What happened was they came down south where a white culture, particularly a white male culture, is very pronounced. And they said, "Ooh, finally something I can call my own and latch on to culturally." And they embraced it. But you know what happens? When you embrace whiteness as your culture, you automatically and necessarily embrace anti-blackness. Because that's the second thing whiteness does. It creates this equal and opposite category of black. The narrative of racial difference or white supremacy says that people of African descent have inherently less dignity, less worth, less ability, less of everything than white people. And then in between black and white are all the various shades of brown. We're all caught up in this. This isn't just a black-white issue. It's a white, non-white issue for a lot of people. The story in the Harvard Gazette said, "America's traditional racial hierarchy assigns the highest status to whites, followed by Asians with Latinos and blacks at the bottom." And that gets complicated too, right? If you're a light-skinned or a dark-skinned Asian, if you speak with an accent or not, if you culturally assimilate into the dominant white culture. The point is, whiteness creates this other category of non-white and the opposite category of black. So that to embrace whiteness is to embrace this colored hierarchy where people of color are somewhere down below you. What does this all have to do with the church? This idea of whiteness or white supremacy. What does that have to do with Christianity? Well, in the news, there's been talk of white nationalism, this surge of white nationalism for various reasons. Well, I think we have to be specific, and we ought to also be talking about white Christian nationalism. Many people don't realize this, but there were 3 main waves of the Ku Klux Klan. The first was right after the Civil War. The last one was during the Civil Rights Movement. But the second one, right in the middle, was maybe the most widespread and insidious form of the KKK. They had gone dormant for a while, but in 1915, they reorganized. What happened in 1915? First of all, it's the height of the Jim Crow era. Lynchings and segregation, all of that's running rampant. Secondly, there was this movie called Birth of a Nation, not the one that came out a few years ago, the one that came out more than 100 years ago. It was Hollywood's first blockbuster film. It was a 3-hour-long silent movie that purported to tell the story of the noble rise of the KKK, which rose up in the South to take back the South from northern carpetbaggers and black people who were recently freed. White people were so inspired by this movie that one white man, a former Methodist circuit rider, in other words, a former preacher, he assembled a group of other white men to hold a ceremony on the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia. That picture behind me is Stone Mountain, and on the front of it are 3 Confederate, quote-unquote, heroes. They ascended to the top of Stone Mountain, and in a ritual taken from Scotch-Irish lore, they burned a cross. Sound familiar? They also constructed an altar of stone and placed on that altar 2 items. One was an American flag, and the other was a Bible. That Bible was open to Romans chapter 12, which says, among other things, be devoted to one another in love. So what you're seeing, a symbol of racial terrorism, this burning cross, an altar, part of a liturgy and a sacred ceremony. On top of that altar, an American flag symbolizing a perverted form of patriotism that says America is the white man's country, and then next to it, a Bible making sacred all of these ideas. White Christian nationalism. The color of compromise is white. Lastly, the color of compromise is red. A moment ago, I mentioned that white supremacy had 2 effects. It erases ethnicity, and 2, it creates the equal and opposite category of blackness. But there's one more effect. White supremacy says that in order to maintain power, in order to maintain control, violence is necessary. Physical violence has always been a necessary component of white supremacy, but it's one that we don't talk about enough. I want to read to you a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, because I think it captures the idea, the threat of physical violence. He says, it's hard to face this, but all your phrasing, race relations, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience. That it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. And you must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. Later on in this conference, I'll talk about the image of God and how the image of God from Genesis 1:26 and 27 is the fingerprint of God on everyone, no matter your race or ethnicity. And there's something in us that somehow spiritually on a soul level knows this, knows that we are worthy of dignity, no matter what we look like, no matter how much money we have. And so that spirit, which I think is the image of God reasserting itself in our lives, that spirit rises up and causes black people who are enslaved, black people who are segregated against, black people who are marginalized, other people of color who are experiencing oppression. It's that spirit of the image of God that rises up and says, no more. But power never concedes power easily. So what happens is, in a white supremacist society, you have to tamp down that spirit of resistance, tamp down this idea that I'm worthy of dignity and equality. And you do that through violence. So I warn you, what I'm about to describe is a lynching. I do it not for any sense of sensationalism, but I do it because if you don't understand the violence, and sometimes in detail, then you will not consider racism or white supremacy as the urgent and dangerous matter that it is. So, as with many of these cases, the details are a bit fuzzy. It was 1904 in Mississippi. It's not clear how the altercation began, but we know it was about love. According to historian Chris Myers-Ash, Luther Holbert, a black worker on the James Eastland plantation in Sunflower County, Mississippi, he had been living with Mary, who was the wife or ex-wife of another worker, Albert Carr. Holbert and Carr had a dispute over the romance, and eventually the plantation owner, Eastland, intervened. So Carr, this other black sharecropper, and Eastland, the plantation owner, who was white, of course, went to Luther Holbert's cabin armed with guns. Only the results, not the details of the encounter, are known. At the end of the altercation at the cabin, both Eastland, the white plantation owner, and Carr lay dead at the hands of Luther Holbert. So one black sharecropper killing another black sharecropper is no big deal in a white supremacist society, but when a black sharecropper kills a white plantation owner, that is a death sentence. So Jim Crow justice was quick and certain. Luther and Mary Holbert, they went on the run. They hid for 3 days. They ran in swamps. Mary dressed up as a man to disguise herself, but the posse of white men and bloodhounds caught up with them. But they didn't do the lynching right away. They actually waited for a particular day of the week, Sunday. And they didn't do the lynching just anywhere, an open field or a town square. They did it on the grounds of a black church. Why the black church? The black church has always been the ark of refuge for black people, always been a place of organizing and uplift. And so to conduct a lynching of black people on black church property says you're not safe anywhere. And they didn't just kill them, they tortured them. More than 1,000 people showed up to gawk at the lynching of Luther and Mary Holberts. First, the white murderers cut off each of their fingers and toes. And they didn't just discard them, they gave them away as souvenirs. Then they beat the bodies of Luther and Mary Holbert so mercilessly that one of Luther Holbert's eyes hung dangling from its socket. The Vicksburg Evening Post reported at the time that the most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew in the hands of some of the mob. The instrument was bored into the flesh of the man and woman, in the arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out the spirals, tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh. Finally, the Holberts, who were still alive, were taken to a pyre. The white men cruelly forced 2 black men, under the threat of death, to drag the Holberts to the fires. They burned Mary alive so that Luther could see his beloved killed, and then they burned him. The reason why black people and other people of color are so sensitive to language is because we know that language at some point always has to be reinforced with action. So that a racist comment isn't just words. We know that to reinforce those words, at some point there will be physical violence involved. I wish I had time to go into the origins of the police force, of the ideology, the long history behind the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a hashtag that became popular in the 2010s, but it's an idea and a sentiment that traces back hundreds of years. The point is this: if you tolerate the words and the ideas, know that at some point those words and ideas that are white supremacist and greedy will eventually result in physical violence. So the book, The Color of Compromise, is a book about the past, but it's really about the future. Where do we go from here, and what do we do? How do we respond to something called the fierce urgency of now? That's a phrase from Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. I want us to listen to King talking in 1963 about the fierce urgency of now.
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
I love that phrase, the fierce urgency of now. King said, this is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. I'm afraid that when it comes to racial justice, the American church has overdosed on the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. The most frequent question I get when I come to these events or speak on this topic is, what do we do? How do we respond to the fierce urgency of now? I want to give you a very loose framework and then conclude with a word of challenge to you, yes, you, even college students. I talk about something called the Arc of Racial Justice. It's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, and Commitment. What do you do about racial justice? You take action in all three of these areas. First of all, increase your knowledge. This is the information age, and knowledge about race and racism has never been more accessible through books, through documentaries, through an internet search. One of my favorite responses to questions I get about race and racism is just 2 words long: Google it. It's out there. Race and racism, they have a playbook, and you got to know how it works if you want to provide effective solutions. Secondly, it's relationships. This is critical. When God wanted to reconcile humanity to God, He didn't send a tweet or a text message. He sent His Son. He sent a person. And so as we seek to bridge racial divides and improve race relations and racial justice, it's going to take relationships, especially if you're in the racial majority, if you're white. You're going to have to go out of your way to develop relationships with people who aren't like you because the whole system has been set up to keep you separated from everyone else. Schooling, housing, jobs. It won't just happen automatically. And lastly, it's commitment. It's not just about relationships. Christians often stop there. At the lunches, at the pulpit swaps. But all the cups of coffee in the world aren't going to do a thing about mass incarceration. All of the pulpit swaps in the world aren't going to solve the racial wealth gap. So what do? You commit to changing policies that create or perpetuate racial inequality. The arc of racial justice. Lastly, I could go on and on about specific actions you can take to work for racial justice, but I don't think that's the problem. When it comes to racial justice in the church, I don't think we have a how-to problem, but a want-to problem. If I gave you 5 minutes, you could come up with a list of several anti-racist actions or find individuals or organizations that are already doing the work. It's not a question of how, it's a question of will. And more than half a century later, after King uttered those words, the fierce urgency of now, I think in many ways we as the church need to respond to the fierce urgency of now when it comes to race. And I'll tell you this, many of the most active civil rights activists were right at your age. They were in high school, they were in college, they were teenagers, they were in their early 20s. They used their education, they used their background, they used their mobility, they used their knowledge to fight. So if you're sitting here thinking, I can get to this after graduation, I can get to this after finals, I can get to this after midterms, understand people are still being killed. People are still suffering. So what is your job? What is your responsibility in all of this? Yes, this is a season for you to take in and to learn and to dissect and to come up with things, but you got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You got to be able to care and take action even while you're informing and growing yourself. Why? Because it's urgent. This is life or death. This is not optional. This is not an extracurricular activity that you tack on to make your resume look better. Working for justice, doing mercy and loving mercy and kindness, that's part of your call as a believer. A lot of us who are younger and didn't live through the civil rights movement would say, oh, well, if I was alive then, I would have marched with King, I would have boycotted, I would have held the signs, I would have done the sit-ins, I would have picketed. Okay. But you know, the civil rights movement never goes away. It just has kind of peaks and valleys. I think we're in another wave of the civil rights movement. And don't say you would have been active then if you aren't doing anything now. The question is not how to fight racism. The question is, will you fight it? Thank you.